Hello, welcome to Scrap Time. My name's Christine, and in this video we are going to be talking about gesso. Now, gesso is one of those main things that you first learn about when using mixed media. And I know there's a lot of new people constantly wanting to start, especially crafters, wanting to start doing mixed media techniques, but they don't understand what all the products do and what they are. So in this video that I'm going to talk a bit about gesso, and hopefully by the end you'll understand it. Now you have to think of gesso, it is basically surface prep or a paint primer. So you can compare that to when you're painting your walls, you put a primer on and that seals like your drywall before putting your paint on. And it allows your paint on your walls to have a nice smooth finish. Well, that's basically what gesso does. It preps your surface, so then when you go in with your acrylic paints, you'll have a nice surface to work on and the paints will glide across the surface. So when you're painting on paper or canvas, if you don't prime it, what happens is that paper is a porous material and the paper wants to suck in all your product. And so by putting the gesso on, you're coating it, you're sealing it, and now it's allowing you to paint over basically any surface. Now, however, there are different types of gesso. So if you're shopping for Liquitex or Golden, then they'll have these little guides. So this is prep, it's closer to the fluid, it's a matte finish, and it's opaque. Now, when you're working just with acrylic paints, you can have everything from translucent, transparent, to opaque and heavy body. But so with the gesso, it's matte versus a lot of acrylic paints have a bit of shine to it. Now this one I like to use when I am just covering a piece of paper, and that is why I bought it, because I'm going to pour it out on here and you can see how fluid it is. I was able to just pour it right out. Now I like to use a palette knife. The reason I don't typically use brushes is because the brush will absorb some of the paint and you'll lose some of your paint. With a palette knife, because it's either plastic or metallic, you won't lose any of your paint. It's also good for just smoothing out. So if I'm coating a piece of paper that I want to do some technique on top of, I want to get it coated, but at the same time, I like to put in some texture. Because this is very fluid, I won't get high peaks, but I can just like do this, and you might be able to see that I'm forming, it's not smooth. Do you see, can you see that on the camera? It's not a smooth surface. I'm like adding in some bumps. And by doing that, it will dry like that. And then when you go to apply your next layer, you can have some sort of neat texture to it. Now, once gesso is applied, it's good for acrylic paints and pigment products, but it's not good for dyes or water-based products. Dyes and water-based products will wipe right off gesso. So it is more for if you're doing acrylics or using really heavy pigment products. So this next gesso I'm going to show you, this is a Golden product. They have a different little map here. It's opaque, it's matte, and it's still on the thin side, but it's more medium. This is the type of gesso. It's the medium one that if you're going to buy one gesso, you're starting mixed media, that's what you want to buy. And I'm going to recommend to crafters just to buy the Ranger gesso. I'll put a link below, but that one will be a nice medium gesso for you to use, and you can use it for numerous things. This very thin gesso I showed you is good for covering things, whereas but this thicker gesso will give you a little bit more options. So I think a middle road gesso for the beginner is what you want. Now I'm using Liquitex and Golden because I live near an art supply store. So it's easier for me to go to the art supply store to buy my supplies than to order products when it comes to like mediums. So this one, it's not going to be that much thicker, but you can see here, can you see how it's hanging off? So it's not just dripping down. So it is a little thicker than the other one, but not by much. But I can hold it. You can do this through stencils for different techniques. I'm going to show you a couple techniques afterwards. But like I can still thin it out. I can put it thin, but at the same time, I can get chunkierness to it. So it's just a little thicker than the first one I showed you. And that's why I have two. If I'm doing more techniques, I probably will use this one. When I'm just covering my pages, I like to use the Liquitex. But I do a lot of projects. So as I said, if you're a beginner, you just need one. Now this last one I'm going to show you is super heavy gesso. So again, we look here. It's a prep material. It's quite thick, not the thickest, but quite thick. It's matte and opaque. So you'll really see the difference here. I'm just going to wipe off my palette knife before digging in there. So look at that. It is chunky and it will stay chunky. Now, the majority of crafters don't need this. This is for painters who really want to get a lot of texture on the base. Like, look at that. This stuff is thick. So it's more if you're really looking to get some high peaks and heavy texture on like big painted canvases or something. Typically for crafters, you don't need this thick gesso. It just has a specific technique that it would be used for. If you do have it though, say you bought the wrong one, you can still use it. You can see you can thin it out and you can still use it to cover your pages and do techniques. But when you're shopping for gesso, you do not need the super heavy gesso as a crafter. So I'm going to just show you a few techniques now using gesso. Clean off my palette knife, just like that. I didn't even need water and I'm done. So I'm going to put this aside. So first off, this is just a piece of paper, and I just wanted to show you that I had this really thin, inexpensive piece of paper, but I covered it with the gesso, and now I can use it for my mediums, my paints, my pigment mediums and that. And so it allows you to use any paper you want with paints. So that's one way how you can use it. Here, I covered this with gesso, and then I went in with distress crayons, and it allowed me to smudge the crayons. If you don't put gesso down before you use the crayons, the paper just absorbs the crayon, and although you can still wet them and do some techniques, you can't go in with your finger and move them around. And so by adding that gesso, it allows you to move the pigment around and smudge it with your finger. So there are certain products that really work well. Once you put your gesso down, you can do a lot more techniques with them. So this is a page I have, and you might be able to see I put gesso through a stencil. And earlier I said how gesso and watercolor don't work well together. However, as a technique, you can do it. So I just wanted to show you that and how the watercolor resists the gesso. I have some paints here. These are watercolor paints. So I'm just going to go in, pick up some color. And so you can see where that gesso was now and how the watercolor is being resisted by the gesso. And the paper where it's dark is absorbing the color, and then where it's lighter is where the gesso was. And so you can use the gesso like that for a technique with watercolor. And that's why you can see if the whole thing was gesso, how the watercolor would just sort of peel up on it and resist on it. So that should hopefully explain that a bit better for you. And then the last technique I sort of wanted to show you is how you can use the gesso as a color wash. So I have this paper here, and I use Distress inks on it. I'm pretty sure they're the oxide inks. And then I have emboss, so that embossing will probably resist it a bit. And so what I want to do, make sure my paintbrush doesn't have blue on it still. Going to open this up. I'm going to put it right on. Now, I'm not trying to cover this up so you can't see anything. What happens when you do a gesso wash sometimes is that it will pick up the color that's below it, and then it will mute it out. So you can use gesso to sort of cover what you did, but that's not sort of the point here. The point is I wasn't too fond of those colors, but by doing a gesso wash over it, it picked up the color, so I still have color, but it's not as major as before. So it sort of gives me a new base to work on. And you can see though, gesso being an acrylic went over a lot of that embossing. Now I could like wash it down more and reveal it, but acrylic paint will go over like plastic things such as embossing. So the texture is there, but it's covered it up. However, it still picked up the color, so even I don't have a white base, but I now have more muted colors that I prefer to restart the background on because the color combination wasn't really my thing. So that's a few ways. Yes, it is a prep, but in mixed media, you can use it on top to do different techniques. You can use it for resist. So there's so much you can do with gesso, but hopefully it will just try and explain the main purpose is for sealing up papers so you can start different techniques. And if you have questions, feel free to leave them below and I will try and answer them for you. Thanks for watching. Be sure to give our video a thumbs up and subscribe to Scrap Time videos on YouTube. In the meantime, here are a couple other videos you might be interested in watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.